Welcome back to another episode of Divorce Altitude. This is Ryan Kalamaya. This week, we're going to be talking about discounts. We are entering the holiday season at the time of this recording, and everyone's looking for a discount. And that would also apply to Eric and Melanie Wolf, our hypothetical divorce clients going through a divorce of their own, and specifically when involving businesses. And in previous episodes, Amy and some of our other guests have talked about discounts and business valuations. But this week, we're going to be talking with an expert on business valuations, Ron Seigneur. He wrote an article for the Colorado Lawyer. We've referenced that trade publication before in October, and he addressed some of the issues, uncertainties in business valuations that frequently do come up, and we're going to dig into those with Ron. But let me introduce our listeners to who Ron is. He's a founding partner of Senior and Gustafson, which is based in Lakewood, Colorado. He's responsible for financial forensics, business and intellectual property valuation, practice management consulting, and exit and succession planning services. He's the co-author of several articles, books. He's starting a guide, a financial expert guide for family law professionals and judges. We're going to talk about that at the end. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Denver, Daniels College of Business, where he teaches business appraisal classes. And he's also the vice chair of the Business Valuation Committee for the American Society of Appraisers. I could go on and on. We could talk about Michigan State versus University of Michigan, where he got an MBA and all of that. But before I go on, Ron, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm really excited to be here, and I will enjoy the opportunity to discuss what we're going to go through today.
Yeah, so let's lay the groundwork. Eric Wolf, our hypothetical divorce client, he is going through a divorce and there's a business. So can you tell our listeners what are the different kinds of value that one would look at in a divorce or just in tax or some other valuation metric when we're talking about a closely held business?
Yes, absolutely. Whenever we're engaged to value a closely held business, there are three fundamental questions that we always start with, regardless of whether it's a divorce or an M&A transaction or estate planning. The date of valuation, what date do we need it valued as of? Because that value can change based on things in the economy and COVID and everything else. The premise of value, is it a going concern versus is it a business that's about ready to be liquidated? In the standard of value. And there are three primary standards of value to choose between. There's fair market value, which is defined by the U.S. Treasury, and it's in the regulations used for tax-related valuations and other purposes. There's fair value, and there's fair market value, investment value. And each of those standards of value will lead you to a different result when we go about doing our analytical procedures to come up with an opinion as of the value of Eric Wolf's business. In divorce in Colorado, typically the two choices are fair market value, and fair market value is essentially what's it worth between a willing buyer and a willing seller, each being knowledgeable of the facts and neither being under duress to complete the transaction. That's paraphrasing the U.S. Treasury definition of fair market value. Versus investment value, what's it worth to a specific individual? And in Colorado divorce, there's case law that supports investment value, sometimes in Colorado divorce known as value to the owner versus fair market value, the definition I just gave. And those are it's a legal distinction. It's at the discretion of the court in Colorado. And if the court chooses fair market value, you might get to apply discounts to Eric's interest in his closely held business, where if it's the value to the owner, the value to Eric, typically discounts aren't appropriate. And I can expand on those, but that's at least the initial ground rules.
Yeah. So can you get into some of the characteristics that would maybe be different between investment value that would be representative of fair market value. So, like you mentioned, what are the kind of characteristics of a seller and a buyer that is assumed in the fair market value um, hypothetical or premise of value?
Under the definition of fair market value, the expanded definition is that the buyer and seller are hypothetical individuals. They're just the average buyer, average seller, each being knowledgeable of the pertinent facts and neither being under duress. It also assumes that there's an appropriate exposure of the business or the portion of the business to the marketplace, that neither are under kind of a time constraint. The value is defined in cash or cash equivalents. And that makes up the definition of fair market value broadened out, if you will, for the other elements of the definition versus investment value. What's it worth to the specific individual? And I like to, in the context of family law, I like to say, what is Eric willing to pay into the marital estate to retain the benefits of the ownership of his business or his professional practice? And it's what are his motivations? Because he may have certain client relationships, vendor relationships. He may have motivations. He has a certain tax status that's unique to him, where a hypothetical buyer is like in an average tax position, if you will.
In Ron, what's your observation about Eric in terms of what's he going to be arguing, investment value or fair market value in the divorce?
Likely arguing fair market value, particularly if his ownership is less than a controlling interest, because under the definition of fair market value for a minority ownership, that being less than a controlling, which is typically 50% absent voting arrangements, you get to take discounts for lack of marketability, the fact that it's a closely held business as compared to a publicly traded security, and a discount for lack of control, sometimes called a minority interest discount. Those are synonymous terms. But if Eric owns a 25% interest in Acme Widgets, for example, under fair market value, what would a hypothetical willing buyer pay for Eric's 25% interest in Acme Widgets? They're going to say, gee, I don't have control and I can't turn around and liquidate my interest because it's a closely held business. Therefore, I demand discounts. And those discounts can, it's subject to professional judgment, that there's lots of resources on how you determine the magnitude of discounts, but a 20, 25, 30% discount for both lack of marketability and lack of control is not inappropriate under a fair market value definition for a lack of a less than controlling interest.
We'll talk about those discounts because that is always interesting to me. But for listeners, I just want to zoom out a little bit in the sense of just putting it into context, because the reason that Eric would, if he's going to get the business, that he would argue for a fair market value is because there's going to be additional discounts and it's going to be less on his side of the ledger or in his basket of goods that are going to come out of his divorce. So that means that he has to offset or pay Melanie less. So he's going to argue the fair market value. But Ron, let me ask you, if Eric says, listen, Apple or Tesla or any of these companies, publicly traded companies, that's a real business. But this business that I run, it's a closely held business. I can't get anything for it. It's just me. It's just Goodwill. Can you explain for listeners that may be thinking along the lines of Eric about how Colorado views Goodwill in just business, closely held businesses, just in general?
Ryan, now you've cracked the door open into another kind of hot area, and that's goodwill and distinguishing what we call enterprise goodwill from personal goodwill. Some businesses and professional practices are highly dependent upon the individual or the individuals to bring the business in the door. The reputation is the individual. That happens a lot with attorneys and doctors and accountants for that matter, where some businesses, it's the business itself that has value. It's the enterprise. We've created a brand and people know the brand, and it's beyond kind of the individual or the individuals that own it. And there's lots of arguments and tools and methodologies to try to put a number on the goodwill. It happens a lot for tax planning and financial reporting. It's all subject to a lot of professional judgment. In a business like Eric has, you're gonna look at saying how important is Eric to this business? If Eric gets hit by a bus, will the business survive? Will it take a hit? Will it go on as it has before? And those are all things that, as a business analyst, we consider that as part of the equation of trying to figure out what Eric's interest is worth.
Yeah, the short answer for listeners is that those professional businesses, the lawyers going through divorce, the doctors going through divorce, the accountants, that they will say this is just it's just me. And the way that Colorado views it is a little bit different than maybe some other states. And like the appreciation on separate property, and Colorado has a fairly progressive view on appreciation of separate property being considered marital. There's also a pretty progressive view in terms of valuing professional businesses with respect. So that's why you get into these arguments, because a lot of times businesses will exist and we're valuing businesses in divorce. So, Ron, going on to the investment value versus fair market value. So, investment value, your article gives the overview. And for listeners, the seminal case is Thornhill. And so sometimes people will say, give me a Thornhill discount or something. And so can you explain Thornhill and what that did for you, Ron, as a business valuation expert? What happened, what you were doing before Thornhill and what you were doing now, and the issues that arise from Thornhill?
The short answer is Thornhill created more work for us because it broadened the landscape for judicial officers in terms of being able to choose between fair market value and investment value. Prior to Thornhill, the case law, Graff, Martin, Huff are the three that I always think of, always said the value of this business or this professional practice is the value to the owner, the investment value to the identified individual. And then along came Thornhill. Thornhill was a divorce case in Grand Junction. Mr. Thornhill was the 70% owner of his business that was an oil field services business. And the appraiser used fair market value and took a 35% discount for lack of marketability on Mr. Thornhill's 70% controlling interest. So that in and of itself is unique, that you'd have a 35% discount on a controlling interest versus a minority interest, because Mr. Thornhill owned a 70% interest. That case was appealed to the Court of Appeals and appealed to the Colorado Supreme Court, that the trial judge did not abuse his discretion in allowing fair market value to be used. It didn't opine on the magnitude of the discount, which is unfortunate because that discount's just way out of line with what we normally see. But so it allows the trial court now to say, gee, we can use the Thornhill fair market value precedent, or we can use the longstanding Graff, Martin, Huff precedent of value to the owner. And it gives the trier of fact a broader range of discretion of kind of what value they want to use for the business interest at issue.
In essence, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ron, but the marketability discount, that 35%, that is a 35% discount on what would have been just the normal investment value. But it was to essentially compensate the owner, Mr. Thornhill, or in our kind of hypothetical situation, Eric, for the lack of liquidity, the aspect that he would need presumably to have a business broker and to sell the business, that there would be a commission with that, and he couldn't liquidate that business interest in the same way of a Apple stock or Tesla or something of that variety. And so essentially there was this kind of phantom 35% interest, even though he may not ever sell, Mr. Thornhill may not have ever sold that oil and gas service business in Grand Junction. So is that one way to look at it? And the result in 2008, which is what happened with Thornhill, is now business valuation experts are routinely giving two numbers. So there's the fair market value number. If Eric and Melanie are going through a divorce and I call up you, Ron, and I say, hey, we want you to be a joint expert. Can you value Eric Wolf's business? Then what are you going to put in terms of your numbers? Are you just going to put one, or are you going to have the investment value and fair market value?
There's two things I'd like to address. One is the 35% discount and the lack of liquidity, because even though Thornhill's business was a closely held business as compared to an Apple or Tesla, where you can call your broker and say, I want to sell my Apple stock and put the money in my account within 3 business days. Thornhill is closely held. So Mr. Thornhill, we had discretion at 70% to say, I want to sell. He would need to go find a broker and pay probably some professional fees. So there is indeed a liquidity discount that would be applicable for a controlling interest, but that's typically a 5 or 10% discount, because Mr. Thornhill, even though it may take him a year or two to sell his oil field business, he still gets the benefit of his ownership while he's putting it on the market and going through the process to get it sold. To your second point, you call and say, gee, Ron, we'd like you to value Eric's business. And I say, what standard of value would you like me to use? And you say, I don't know, what's appropriate? And I go, it depends on what the court chooses to apply. And we're not going to know unless we get an advance ruling, which is highly unusual in family law, for the judge to say, I stipulate that we're going to use X standard. I tell you, I'll do it both ways. And then when we get to court, the judge now has the latitude to say, here's senior's fair market value opinion, and here's senior's investment value opinion.
The theme through your article, which I really did appreciate, was that we have a messy situation right now, and it's not, I don't think, helpful to Eric and Melanie Wolf, because it's good for a divorce lawyer like me, because I can argue. If I'm representing Eric, I'm going to argue for fair market value. If I'm Melanie, I'm going to be arguing for investment value. We really don't have any guidance from the court on when is appropriate to apply. And we get into these arguments about, I've seen this judge do this in this case, and I've seen this judge do that. And you don't really know if I know my judges, because I practice in limited areas very intimately, and I have a pretty good idea. But what are the things that parties and family law attorneys and judges can do to reduce those arguments or to overcome some of those disagreements, Ron?
They can agree on the standard of value to be applied in advance of engaging a valuation professional to be involved, saying we're going to use investment value for this particular assignment and have at it. Now, typically I've seen that happen, but normally we don't know what the judges like the discretion of being able to push the number one way or another. It's a court of equity. I'm reminded continually, and I'm sure you are too, and they're trying to get to an equitable result. And sometimes we're not quite sure how they determine what equity is in the final analysis.
What instances do you think it's appropriate to use investment value versus fair market value? Can you give our listeners some instances when you apply different standards of value?
Yeah, I think that one of the issues is if there isn't any evidence of an impending sale of the business, that the property spouse, the owner of the business, is going to continue to own it and run it, and it's going to be a going concern. It's just going to continue on as it has in the past. It's that continuing ownership interest that provides the value to that individual. And unless there's an imminent sale, to me, that is strong evidence that the value to that particular individual at their tax rate ought to be what's appropriate to apply.
And can you give the listeners, can you talk maybe a little bit? We've talked about the marketability discount, the 35%. When I'm arguing for Eric Wolf, I love Thornhill because that is an extraordinary rate when you consider it to Shannon Pratt or some of the other valuation resources, guides that exist out there on valuations. 35% is extraordinary. But what things go into, for example, lack of control or a minority discount? Can you give us kind of some different examples of Eric Wolf if he owns 51% of a condo in Florida with his friends? Is that different than he owns a 10% interest with his family partnership, or he's the CEO of a company that has 90%? What can you walk us through some of the things with respect to the minority discount?
Yeah, I'll use an example to answer that. Let's say you're valuing a 2% interest in a business. Somebody only owns 2%, but the other two owners each own 49%. All of a sudden, your 2% interest is night and day to either of the 49% owners, that they'd be willing to pay a premium for your 2% because maybe they don't like the other 49% owner. It could be a family member, it could be anybody, but if I can buy your 2%, now all of a sudden I'm the controlling person with 51, and I can make it difficult for the 49% owners. So now if you're 2% owner and you're one of 52% owners, then nobody in the other 2% pool is going to be willing to pay you much because, gee, I go from 2% to 4%, no big deal. So that's one way you can't look at it in a vacuum. And a lot of it has to do with kind of what's the marketability of the interest. There's some types of businesses that are, if you put it up for sale, people would buy it. Others, that's an old and tired thing and it's on its way out and we're not going to pay you a premium for it.
So if it's an estate planning lawyer, those practices generally there's a market for those because they have existing client relationships. They're generally long-standing relationships. And this can be different than a firm that is like my firm that does personal injury, family law, and criminal defense, where there's a fair amount of turnover. And if there's no indication of that there is going to be a sale, is that run where you're looking at more like an investment value for the kind of practice like my firm versus an estate planning attorney that is maybe 50 years old that's been talking about succession and that has done some preliminary analysis on selling his or her law firm?
Great question, Ryan. And it delves into an area that is an area of focus for us because I was a legal administrator back in the 1980s for about 7 years with a 50 attorney firm and have worked with a number of firms and valued a number of law firms for various purposes. But an estate planning firm has a file room full of files waiting to go through probate. And it's a money machine because of what's in the file room versus, like you said, someone that's a criminal law attorney that, I want to hire, that person because that's the best person to do this. And I won't take a second line. So the first practice has a lot of goodwill value associated with the files. The second, it's all in the individual. And when that individual goes, so goes the value proposition.
Yeah, and I think a CEO or a tech executive in Boulder, if Eric Wolf, if he's got a company that is a crypto business or a cybersecurity, and it's clear that the ultimate goal is to be acquired or to sell, do an IPO, that's gonna be different than if he's an anesthesiologist that gets the country club and his car and all of these value added things, these perks, these fringe benefits. And there's just no indication that there's ever going to be a sale of that interest in whatever that medical practice is. And so are those kind of examples of when it might be appropriate to use a fair market value for the kind of tech executive that, that there might be a sale and they've been talking about it versus the doctor that is more likely going to be an investment value or the value to the owner?
Yeah, the anesthesiologist, you're going to take a close look at what that person's being paid in relation to their peer group pay to see if there's anything above and beyond kind of their peer group compensation that might be evidence of profits from maybe a larger anesthesiology practice versus the tech guy. The value might be the payoff that's already targeted, that we're going to build this up and sell it. So the whole valuation mindset from our end is different. Different things are in play. Reasonable compensation for the owner employee is always, with either of those two examples, is always at play, where we're going to be looking at what's that anesthesiologist, how hard are they working? What are they getting paid for their years of experience in the geographical area that they serve, and any specialty designations in relation to what they're actually earning, to see if there's some profit above and beyond the value of their services. And that's always just an important part of the analytical process, if you will.
Yeah. And for listeners, generally speaking, there's these professional decisions that are made by people like Ron, where they'll say, this is the discount. You heard him talk about opine on different discounts, but always reasonable compensation, because Ron, what happens to the business valuation when that reasonable compensation is 500,000 for Eric Wolf compared to 250,000, just as a general matter?
When you're saying Eric's earning 500,000 and his peer group is 250,
If you determine his reasonable compensation is 500,000 compared to 250,000, what does that do to the value of the business just between those two, that decision between 500 and $250,000?
it means that there's no profit to the enterprise. Then it's all, Eric's potentially being overpaid for his services, but if the true value of Eric is that amount and he's not receiving that, then there's nothing left in the business in terms of a value proposition.
Right. Generally speaking, the higher the reasonable compensation for the party in the divorce, Eric Wolf, the lower the business valuation, because it just means that there's less profits. And so Eric is always arguing, my compensation should be higher. It should be higher. And they're always pushing you. So what are the things, Ron, to switch gears a little bit, about volatility? Right now, as we're recording this, there's a lot of volatility in the market and the economic climate. What are the challenges, and how do you address those as a business valuation expert when you've got these uncertainties on what premise of value do you even start with? But then, even taking it a step further, how do you reflect the volatility, and how does that come into play with your valuation opinions?
The best way for me to answer that is with everything that's happened, the pandemic pause and supply chain disruption, and even what we're currently experiencing with inflation. It's made historical activity for a lot of businesses inappropriate to use as the primary framework to value the business. And we end up using more a forward-looking methodology than relying on historical financials and tax returns to calculate our values. But it's interesting that the courts have always been reluctant to use forward-looking models, discounted cash flow. Let's project out what the business will earn. Let's deduct out reasonable compensation for the owner employee, figure out what profit is left over, and present value that back to today at an appropriate risk-adjusted rate as an indication of the value of the business above and beyond the service of the owner employee. Now, we like that because it's becoming a more useful model, because we can't look at valuation multiples from databases that we have because they're just obsolete. They're no longer relevant because of pandemic disruption and so on. The courts are slowly coming around to embrace forward-looking models because they understand that it gets to a better result, at least a more supportable result, notwithstanding that it requires speculation into the future. How's this business going to perform in the future? Speculation of what tax rates are going to be appropriate in the future versus just looking at 5 years worth of tax returns and weighting those 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's the way it was done when we had a stable economic environment for the luxury of 15 to 20 years until maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But our whole world has changed as valuation practitioners, where we're being called upon in many venues, well beyond family law, to do more forecasting, projecting, present value analysis to come up with our valuation opinions.
Yeah, and maybe to highlight that would be the scenario where Eric Wolf, if he's a mortgage broker and he just crushed it in 2021 and 2020 because real estate and interest rates were really low. And then the Fed starts raising interest rates, and now mortgages are at a historic high, or at least recent history high. And the mortgage refinance, the originations on mortgage, if he's a mortgage broker, they have completely dried up. So to your point, Ron, it's saying, all right, Eric, let's look into the future, because if we look at what Eric earned over the last 5 years, or, last year, last 2 years, it's just not, that was an aberration, or it's not going to be a real good predictor of what he's going to earn in the future.
Ryan, the example of a mortgage broker is an excellent example of somebody, like you said. If you look at past performance, they're just knocking it down. Now all of a sudden they've just run into a wall where their business is coming to an abrupt, it may not stop completely, but the future is not anywhere like what the past indicates.
I think a lot of people listening to this, it's like, what are my takeaways? What can I do if I'm Eric Wolf and I'm a mortgage broker? Am I just screwed because the Colorado first looks at personal goodwill, and then there's no real guidance, and this is just going to be fodder for a bunch of lawyers and experts and everything? So what are takeaways for Eric? What were things that he could do to mitigate his risk? And maybe as part of that, you could talk about your financial expert guide for family law judges and attorneys that you guys are finalizing.
Thank you for that reference. With Eric being using an example of being a mortgage broker, there's always going to be, how long is this disruption going to last? At some point, we're going to get back to the real estate industry is not going to go away. People buying and selling houses is not going to go away. Interest rates will moderate. There has to be some kind of understanding of how long this period of extreme volatility in that particular sector is going to last, as part of the kind of the valuation equation, if you will. But to talk a little bit about the book that we're publishing, it's called The Financial Expert Guide for Family Law Judges and Attorneys. And we have what's called the Colorado edition that's been out for a couple of years, but we're just in the process of finalizing the national edition of that book that we hope to have out by the first quarter of next year. The three authors are myself, John Tatlock, who's a family law attorney here in town, and Kevin Yiannopoulos, who's another valuation professional like myself based in Tucson. And it's going to be published by Business Valuation Resources. And it's intended to be a resource for the less experienced family law practitioners. And frankly, a lot of the judges on the bench these days they're assistant DAs that know everything about prosecuting a DUI. But when it comes to how do we value Eric's closely held business interest, it's like they're lost in the haze. So we talk about standards of value, methodologies, discounts, all the types of things that we as valuation practitioners need to do to render a credible opinion on the value of a business.
Yeah, and I used to be a DA, and it took me a while to understand some of these issues. And I was fortunate to have people like you, Ron, that guided me, the experts, family law attorneys. They can't know everything, but I think for Eric, the point is to make sure, if there is a business involved, to make sure that they have an attorney that understands, some of these issues, and can basically present their case, but also either to have a joint expert and potentially a consulting expert. We've had various episodes on joint valuation experts, and we'll have some of those referenced in the show notes, the kind of strategy involved. But really, to have someone like you, Ron, that is looking over someone's shoulder, and they know that things are handled appropriately, because there are some joint experts that could just use a 5-year average on a mortgage broker business, and then you get into the arguments, and it's not as if Eric is totally screwed, because he does have options. It just depends on what the original kind of valuation, how he can work out with Melanie and her attorney, if they can come to an agreement on, a premise of value and to try to really narrow those issues. But I think that the point of this episode is to educate Eric and other, especially less experienced attorneys about the kind of various landmines that exist out there when it comes to valuing closely held businesses, and to make sure that they have the resources. And it could be the financial expert guide or your service or somebody in like you coming to their side to help guide them, whether it be questions that to ask at trial or to push a joint expert to really oversee that. But I think a lot of people come into divorce, especially people, and Eric Wolf that we've referenced, and they just are not naive, but they're in for a rude awakening because there are a lot of arguments and uncertainty, which is the point of your article.
I was privileged to be asked to submit the article, and it went through a pretty rigorous editorial process. And I did get a call because I talk about a particular case where the standard of value was front and center as the key issue between me and the opposing expert. And after I tried to appropriately sanitize it, but I did get a call from this was an arbitration. I did get a call from the arbitrator after I published the articles, and he was laughing. He was saying I was totally on point, but he was able to kind of see who I was talking about. So, well, I guess that was not a bad thing, but yeah, it was a real
Well,
life example.
yeah, no, and I have actually an article coming out in the Colorado Lawyer in January, in that the editorial process is, as you say, rigorous. But Ron, really appreciate the time. For people that may want to learn more about you, can you give listeners what's the best way to get in touch with you and find you if they have any other questions on valuation? And you might explain to listeners, you do consulting in particular on cannabis industry, and your firm does. Can you maybe sign off with giving an overview of other services that your firm provides and where they can find you?
Yeah, absolutely, Ryan. Thank you for that. Our website is cpavalue.com, one word, cpavalue.com. You can go there to find information on our firm and the way to get in touch with me. We have another website, finexpertdivorce.com, finexpertdivorce.com, which is a website for our book, The Financial Expert Guide. So you can find information on that. I've been a licensed CPA here in Colorado since 1981, and a founder of a CPA firm that we do 2,000 tax returns. I have a partner that has a very unique specialty in animal hospitals and veterinary practices. He has about 80 veterinarians and animal hospitals, so that's a unique specialty for our firm. And as you said, we've gotten into the cannabis space where we do a lot of valuation around the country on cannabis licenses, dispensaries, cultivation facilities. I just got a call earlier today to value a consumption lounge license in Las Vegas. And the cannabis is like valuation on steroids, where we take everything I've learned over the last 3 decades and now put it in the cannabis industry. And it's absolutely fascinating. So I'm having fun with that.
Get ready for the magic mushroom psilocybin gold rush here in Colorado. I think you might be seeing some businesses crop up around that. But Ron, we'll have links in the show notes. And thank you everyone for joining us on Divorce at Altitude. And Ron, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ryan.